Hi, I'm Barry Stewart Mann, and I'm delighted to be here with the Cobb Storytellers for Tellabration 2020. I'd like to share an old Norse myth that connects with one of our time-honored holiday traditions. Everyone loved Baldur. Baldur the Beautiful, they called him, and he was beautiful, and kind, and loving, and gentle, and compassionate, and noble, and wise, and funny, and cheerful. In fact, they say that his face shone like the sun. Well, the time came when his face was no longer shining because he was having horrible dreams every night, and he would wake up in the morning convinced that his death was imminent. And this concerned everyone, and none more than his parents, Odin, the king of the Norse gods, and Frigg, Odin's wife, Baldur's mother. And so Frigg decided to do something. She traveled all over the earth and tried to ask everybody to promise not to harm Baldur. It wasn't hard, for everyone loved Baldur, so the plants and the animals all promised, and the air promised, and the water promised, and the land promised, and the fire promised, and even diseases and venoms and weapons promised. And so she was able to come back to Baldur and say, "My son, you don't need to worry about anything. You are safe. Your dreams mean nothing. Relax." And so he did relax. He felt safe and confident. And the others, the gods and the goddesses, they felt secure as well. And so they devised a game, a sport it was, where they would circle around him and they would throw things at Baldur, rocks and stones and even weapons. And it was amazing. Everything just bounced off of him, for nothing could harm him. Well, along came Loki, the god of guile, deceit, the trickster of the Norse gods. And Loki saw what was going on, and he said to Frigg, "Tell me, is it true that nothing will harm Baldur?" And she said, "Yes, I traveled everywhere, and I convinced everyone." And now Loki was a little jealous. You see, he had 3 children, and they were not treated as well as Baldur was. His son Fenrir, the wolf, had been sent off to an island prison by himself, and his other son Jormungand had been sent down to the bottom of the ocean. He was a serpent. And his daughter, Hale, who was half alive and half dead, she had been sent to the bottom of the world tree to dwell in darkness as the goddess of death in Niflheim. Well, Loki said, "Everyone promised?" And Frigg said, "Oh, yes, everyone." Well, there was a little sprig of mistletoe in the far west of Valhalla, and it didn't seem worth stopping to ask that tiny little harmless sprig of mistletoe to promise, but otherwise all have promised. Well, Loki had what he needed. And so he flew off to the west of Valhalla, and he found that little sprig of mistletoe. And he came back to where the gods and goddesses were playing their game. And he saw them gathered around and throwing things at Baldur, and he saw off to the side there was Hoder. Hoder was Baldur's brother, blind Hoder, Hoder the god of winter. And Loki said, "Hoder, why are you not joining in the game?" And Hoder said, "Well, I cannot see where my brother is, and I have nothing to throw." And Loki said, "Oh, I have this little dart of a sprig. Here, take it, and I will guide your hand." And so with Loki's help, Hoder threw the sprig, and it flew through the air and landed in Baldur's heart, and he died in an instant. And all around him suddenly were shocked and grieving, and none more than his parents, Odin and Frigg. And Odin decided to send Baldur's brother, Hermod, down to Niflheim, down to plead with Hale to let Baldur return to the world above. And by the time that Hermod arrived there in Niflheim, there was Baldur, pale and white as death, seated at the side of the goddess's throne. And Hermod said, "Please, please, Hale, let my brother return to the world of the living. He is beloved by all. The entire world weeps for him." And she said, "Oh, is that right? The entire world weeps for him. If you can prove that the entire world weeps for him, I will let him come back." So Hermod returned to Asgard, and he told Frigg and Odin. And so they sent messengers throughout the realm to make sure that everyone indeed was weeping for Baldur. And the plants and animals were weeping, and so were the air and the water and the land and the fire, and even diseases and venoms and weapons. But as the messengers were on their way back to bring the good tidings to the king and queen of the gods, they saw a cave, and in the cave they saw a giantess with dry eyes. Her name was Thok. And so the messenger said, "Please, Thok, weep for Baldur." And she just looked at them coolly and said, "Why should I weep for him? He has never wept for me." So the messengers had to bring back the bad news that it wasn't true. Not everyone was weeping for Baldur, and they could not attest to Hale. And so Hale kept Baldur there in Niflheim among the dead. And Frigg grieved and grieved and wept, for deep in her heart she knew that that giantess, Thok, was actually that tricky god, Loki. Now this story does not have a happy ending, but there's another version that says that Frigg was able to convince Hale to let Baldur return to the world above. And when he came up, she wept as much as she had wept when he died. She wept now tears of joy. And her tears of sadness at his death and her tears of joy at his return all became those little red berries of the mistletoe. And she found herself underneath an oak tree with mistletoe hanging from it. And so everyone that passed, she had to share her joy with them. She hugged and kissed them. And she decreed that from that moment on, the mistletoe should never be used to harm anyone. It should only bring joy to people. And there's where we have our tradition of kissing under the mistletoe. That is the death and rebirth of Baldur from Norse myth.